In the middle of the Wild West, where the wind blows through the Rocky Mountains like the whispers of the dead, a widow named Clara Whitford stands before an iron cage buried in the middle of town. Inside is the man the whole area calls a monster. Everyone wants him dead. Only she wants to marry him. A choice no one dares to understand. A moment that only those who have experienced deep loss can feel. Clara had traded her safety, her honor, even her life, to protect a stranger. But in reality, how many people in their lives have not faced such a heartbreaking choice? When the heart tells one thing, but the world screams the opposite. If it were you when the whole town turned its back, would you have the courage to stand by someone who was doubted by the whole world? Sometimes the choice we fear the most is the last door that leads to peace. Come join the story. Feel and remember what we lost and what we can save. If you love emotional stories, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. That afternoon, the wind blew down the valley from the Bighorn Mountains, bringing the breath of winter earlier than usual. The sky was a deep gray, the late afternoon light casting a dark and solemn hue across the red rocks. Along the main road of the town of Red Horizon, less than half a mile long, dust swirled in small rolls, tapping the feet of the old wooden posts. The town was not large, but each house, each porch bore the tired look of a frontier that had endured too much loss and dust. In the middle of the square, just a few dozen feet from the town hall building, stood an iron cage nearly as tall as a grown man. The bars were rusty, the welds rough as if hastily made by a blacksmith shivering in the cold. The cage was not for wild animals. It was for people the town considered a threat. Everyone knew that. And today inside the cage was a man the people of Red Horizon called by a contemptuous name, the Ridge Hermit. The square was crowded, almost the whole town was there. Chatter, the stamping of boots, whispers swirled together in a thick steam. Far away, the wind bells hanging over Mrs. Lincoln's grocery store tinkled through the stony air. At that moment, from the end of the dusty road, a woman appeared. She was not young, but no one here would dare say she was old. She was in her 40s, taller than most women in the West, her shoulders slightly slanted because of an old leather suitcase. Her wide-brimmed hat was blown to one side by the wind, her dark brown hair was pinned up at the nape of her neck. She wore a long, ash-gray dress that had faded over the years, and a rough cloth cloak with frayed edges. Clara Whitford, a widow from Missouri, traveled hundreds of miles west in search of a beginning she didn't know existed. She stood at the edge of the square, her breath white as smoke. After a moment, someone recognized her as a newcomer. The crowd began to whisper. Clara heard every word fall on her like cold raindrops. Probably looking for a husband through pen pals. Poor thing, maybe he's dead. Or he never existed. The words were true. The man Clara had come to marry, according to the letter he had sent, had died just weeks before she arrived at Red Horizon. An accident while he was out gathering firewood. That was the first thing she had heard when she inquired at the horse station yesterday. The sense of loss that day was like a sudden gust of wind that had swept away something you had held on to all along the journey. But today it was not that sadness that stopped Clara in the middle of the square. It was the bad news she had heard as soon as she entered the town limits. The sheriff of Red Horizon was going to hang a man that afternoon. He was considered dangerous, a pioneer killer, and had caused many people to lose sleep with fear. Clara stepped into the crowd. She wanted to see for herself whether the man in the cage was the monster the rumors said he was, or just a victim of the wild and judgmental West. As she approached, the town fell silent. Even the men leaning against the fences, the women clutching baskets of half-eaten bread, and the children running about stopped. Clara stopped about 10 feet from the cage. The wind was strong, blowing the ribbon around her wrist. She held it in place and looked inside. The man sat in the corner of the cage, his head bowed. His hair, long enough to touch his shoulders, was disheveled as if it had been windblown for months. His beard covered half his face. His clothes were frayed and burned in places. He looked at no one, did not speak, did not react to the jeers the townspeople threw at him. But when Clara stood before the cage, he looked up. That look, not crazy, not fierce. Just deep, tired, and like it was used to enduring the cruelty of the world. Clara's heart clenched. She couldn't explain why. She just knew it felt real. Sheriff Langton, a burly man in a brown leather jacket, approached. He looked Clara up and down. "What do you want to see him for? This isn't entertainment." Clara took a breath. Her voice was low but clear. "I want to ask him to marry me." The air froze. All sound died away in a heartbeat. Only the wind howled through the cracks in the roof. Then the noise broke out like a flood. She's crazy. What the hell does she think she's doing? Does this woman want to die? The sheriff stepped closer to Clara. What do you mean? Do you know who he is? I know, Clara replied. I know what the town plans to do with him. And I know something else. She looked straight into the eyes of the man in the cage. If no one steps forward, he will die unjustly. A sneer rang out from the back of the crowd. A man lifted his hat and said loudly, "There is nothing wrong with a man like him." Clara turned back calm. I don't know his past, but I do know one thing. The eyes of the innocent are different from the eyes of one who has chosen violence. The crowd murmured again. The sheriff took a deep breath as if trying to regain order. Do you understand me? If you marry him, he is yours. You will have him removed from town immediately, and if he does anything wrong, you are responsible. Clara nodded. I understand. The sheriff looked into the cage. Jonah Hale, he called out. This woman asks you to marry her. Do you accept? No one expected an answer. Jonah had not said a word during his months in captivity. But to everyone's surprise, the man moved slightly. He raised his head and looked at Clara for a long time, without blinking, without fear, without resentment. Then, he nodded. The town erupted in noise. Someone cursed. Someone chuckled in disbelief. Someone said it was a sign of the madness of the year. But Clara didn't hear any of that anymore. In that moment she saw only two things. A man bound in solitude for months, and the nod, a tiny ray of light in the depths of that man's despair. The sheriff sighed reluctantly. The law is the law. If you two want to marry, I will be your witness. But after that you two leave Red Horizon. Before sundown, Clara pursed her lips and nodded. Her hands felt cold, but her heart was as calm as a lake before a storm. Some part of her knew this decision would change everything. The wedding was performed quickly under the porch of the town hall. No flowers, no music, no witnesses other than a few skeptical onlookers out of curiosity. Clara stood before Jonah, her hands shaking in the cold. Jonah stood still, his wrists still bound, his eyes fixed on Clara. The sheriff read a few short sentences. Mr. Jonah Hale, do you take Clara Whitford under the laws of the territory of Wyoming as your lawful husband and guardian? Jonah didn't speak, but he nodded again. The sheriff turned to Clara. Mrs. Clara Whitford, do you agree? Yes, Clara replied before the question ended. The sheriff closed the book. That's it. You're released, Jonah Hale. Now, you two get out of here. Clara and Jonah left Red Horizon under the cold gazes of the entire town. The wind was still blowing, the dust was still swirling underfoot, but Clara sensed something different in the footsteps of the silent man walking beside her. He said nothing, didn't explain, didn't reveal, but she knew. Behind that silence was a story no one in this town was willing to hear. Only, Clara didn't know that from the moment she said, I do. She was about to embark on a journey she could never have predicted. A journey that led to old fears of the West, buried secrets and truths darker than any rumor. The road out of Red Horizon ran like a tightrope between two low hills stretching to the eastern edge of the forest. The wind was still strong, carrying the chill from the Bighorn Range across the yellow prairies that had turned brown with early winter. The sagebrush bushes that lined the road shook in the wind, exuding a distinctly Wild West herbal scent, stinging in the nose but calming in the heart. Clara and Jonah had gone 100 yards when the noise of the town began to recede behind them. Still, she could feel the villagers' eyes on them, as if they were looking at them with a warning that they were doing something against their will. But no one said a word, and Clara did not turn around. Jonah walked to Clara's right, slightly behind her, walking silently, his hands still bound to his waist by the rough, frayed rope. He made no sound except the steady, solid thump of his footsteps on the dry ground. For a long moment no one spoke. Clara glanced up at him several times. Jonah was almost a head taller than her broad-shouldered muscles, hard as steel, forged by wind and rain and years. His appearance was intimidating, but his eyes were not. There was something else in them. Something like the weariness of someone who had endured too long. Finally, Clara spoke. We need to get off the main road. The sheriff's men might be watching. She wasn't sure if Jonah had heard, but he nodded. They turned down a narrow path that ran parallel to the shallow stream. The wind died down, replaced by the crunch of gravel underfoot. A flock of black crows soared from the dead branches, their long, drawn-out cries like a frontier herald. Clara stopped opening the suitcase. "I'll untie you. At least so you can move." She said it calmly, but her heart was still beating fast. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she felt like she was stepping closer to the life of someone she knew so little about. Jonah didn't react for a few seconds. He just stood there, his face turned toward the woods, his ears tuned to the wind. When Clara touched the rope, he flinched slightly, not in refusal, but as if he were used to being attacked by surprise. "I'll be gentle," Clara said slowly, not forcing. Jonah lowered his hand, leaving room for her to insert the small blade. In a few strokes, the rope fell to the ground. He stood there, his wrists marked with deep red marks, some bleeding. He must have been bound like that for weeks, maybe longer. Clara looked at the wounds, her heart aching. "They hurt you," she said, not trying to hide her emotion. Jonah looked down at his wrist. He didn't answer. He just pulled his hand away as if not wanting anyone to notice the old pain. Clara took a clean cloth and a bottle of brown ointment from her suitcase. "Let me apply it. If you don't, it will get infected." She spoke in the voice of someone who had cared for her husband many years before. The voice had the calm of someone who had lost much, understood much, and was not afraid to give a little more love to others. Jonah hesitated. His eyes were fixed on her hand as she uncapped the ointment bottle. Then finally he reached out very slowly, very cautiously. Clara worked gently, careful not to hurt him. The ointment soaked into his skin, melting with the warmth of her fingers. Jonah shivered slightly, not from pain, but because it had been so long since anyone had touched him. The wind blew harder, pulling at their shoulders. In that moment, Clara felt something open between them, not yet trust, but like a tiny crack of light in the wall of isolation Jonah had built over the years. After bandaging it, Clara stood up and pulled her cloak back on. "Let's go. Night falls quickly in these parts." Jonah nodded slightly and went ahead, leading the way by instinct, more accustomed to living in the woods than in towns. He avoided soft ground, choosing paths with flat stones, avoiding obvious footprints. "Do you know the way?" Clara asked. Jonah looked around and then nodded once. His eyes said this wasn't his first time in this area. She asked no further questions. No rush. No intrusion. They had gone about a mile when it began to get dark. The pale blue of the late afternoon faded to a deep purple, then to the black of the mountains. Only the golden light of the new moon shone softly on the jagged rocks. "Let's find a place to stay," Clara said. Jonah pointed to a clump of old cottonwoods along the stream. The trees provided shade from the wind, and there was a large rock that could serve as a seat. Clara sat down, placing her suitcase beside her. Jonah stood a few feet away, as if afraid of disturbing her. But when Clara shivered slightly with cold, he immediately walked into the woods, silent as a shadow. In a few minutes he returned with some dry twigs and a piece of bark. He lit the fire with 2 pointed stones with surprising skill. The sparks flickered, then grew, illuminating his face. The firelight illuminated Jonah's eyes. In the firelight he was not a monster, not a criminal, not someone the town feared. He was just a lonely man trying to find some warmth for himself and the woman who had saved him. Clara opened her suitcase and took out the last of the bread from the trip. "That'll do for dinner. I'll try to find something better tomorrow." She handed half to Jonah. He looked at the cake but didn't take it right away. Maybe he wasn't used to someone sharing something so genuinely. Finally, he took it, nodding his head in a silent. The two ate in silence. The fire crackled in the wind. In the distance, coyotes howled from the hills. The western night sky was filled with a loneliness both Clara and Jonah were familiar with. After a long moment, Clara spoke. "Jonah, I don't know what brought you to that iron cage, but I believe one thing. No one is born a monster." Jonah looked at her, his eyes filled with something hard to name. "Pain, gratitude, or both," Clara continued. "You don't have to say it. I know you're not ready, but I won't force you. Just know, from now on, you're not alone." A gentle breeze blew, lifting the flickering flames. Jonah bowed his head slightly, not because he was sad, but as if he was trying to hold back something that wanted to burst forth from deep within. Clara looked into the darkness before her and asked herself, had she just saved someone, or was she saving the rest of her life? Clara felt a little uneasy, a little trembling, like someone standing at a crossroads where either side leads to change. She knew clearly. After today, neither of them could return to their old lives. The wind of the night in the west is unlike any other. It is not only cold. It carries with it the sounds of the wilderness, the groans of fallen trees, the sighs of animals foraging in the darkness, and sometimes it carries the feeling that someone is watching from afar where the firelight cannot reach. Clara leaned closer to the small fire. The orange glow reflected off the hem of her cloak, flickering in the lines at the corners of her eyes, traces of years of loneliness, of a life she never thought she would start again in this strange land. Jonah sat 6 or 7 feet away from her. He was silent, his shoulders slumped like someone who has to watch his every move. The firelight illuminated the contours of his face, a square face, high cheekbones, eyes so dark they seemed to hold the mountains behind them. He was silent but not cold. His silence was like the sky before dawn, still compressed and strangely, making the other person want to speak softly. Clara exhaled, her breath dissolving in white mist. "Jonah, it's colder tonight than I thought." Jonah looked at her for a second, then stood up. Without a word, he walked into the dark woods behind them. Clara instinctively jumped to her feet. "Where are you going?" There was no answer. Only the sound of his footsteps and the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Clara's heart sank, partly because she was worried that he might be attacked by a wild animal, partly because she was afraid he would run away, a very feminine, very human fear, even though they had known each other for only a few hours. "Clara, calm down," she told herself. "He's not a runaway." He nodded in front of the whole town. No one does that just to disappear into the darkness immediately. Less than 5 minutes later, the footsteps returned. Jonah emerged with a larger bundle of dry twigs and some rolled-up clumps of dry weeds. He set them down by the fire and began weaving them into a simple mat so Clara wouldn't sit directly on the cold ground. Clara pursed her lips. "You care about me?" A question popped into her mind, both surprised and warm. Jonah bent down and added more wood to the fire. The light flared up, illuminating his hands, large, hard, rough, as if made for heavy work, but when he placed the branch on the fire, his movements were gentle, as if afraid to startle her. Clara smiled slightly. "Thank you." Her voice was softer than usual. Jonah didn't respond, but when he returned to his original position, he was about 2 feet closer to her. Just a little, but enough for Clara to feel his warmth. Warm and safe. For a long time no one spoke. The wind whistled through the cottonwood trees. The fire crackled. The sound of the shallow stream flowing through the rocks sounded like the call of a rare, peaceful west. Clara relaxed. "Jonah, I heard you were locked up for months." He didn't look at her, but his shoulders tensed slightly. Clara continued, her voice low and slow. "They say you killed someone." Silence fell like a heavy stone. Jonah turned away, his gaze fixed on the eastern hills where there was only a deep blackness. Clara pursed her lips. "You said to be careful, Clara," a voice inside her reminded her. But then she thought of the cage, thought of Jonah's eyes when they first met, and understood that his silence didn't come from guilt. It came from pain. "I don't ask to judge," Clara said very slowly. "I ask because I want to understand you." Jonah turned back. There was something strange in his eyes, as if he didn't believe anyone would actually want to understand him. But he didn't say it. He couldn't, or not yet. Clara bowed her head, not forcing him anymore. Then suddenly a long howl echoed from the jungle. Then a second, then a third closer. Clara clutched her cloak. "Wolf," she gasped. Jonah stood up immediately. His eyes changed, no longer timid, but the instinct of someone who had lived in the woods long enough to know when real danger was near. He walked over to the fire, pushing the sticks with his feet to make it bigger. Then he signaled Clara to stay back. "Jonah, are there many?" He didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed in the direction of the sound. At least 3, maybe more. Another howl sounded closer, sharper. Clara clutched the hem of her dress. In that moment she realized how fragile the line between life and death was in the West. One slip, and it could all end here, in the middle of a night, with only the stars and the wind as witnesses. Jonah took a step forward, standing between Clara and the night. He had no gun, no knife, just a few burning sticks in his own body. Under the firelight he stood like a towering rock, not trembling, not retreating, not afraid, Clara looked at him, feeling both worried and strange. Strange because that feeling of security was not something she usually felt from people who talked a lot and bragged a lot. Security came from people who knew when to be silent and when to stand in the right place. A noise came from behind the bushes. 2 yellow eyes appeared in the darkness. A wolf. Large. Ribs bulged with hunger. It advanced its feet, crunching loudly on the dry leaves. Jonah bent down and picked up a burning stick. He held it up to make the flame burn brighter. Then he took a step forward and threw it straight at the wolf. The flame swirled through the air, landing in front of the wolf. It flinched, backed away, then growled softly, and disappeared into the darkness. But it wasn't good news. Clara knew the wolf wouldn't leave so easily. Jonah leaned in, listening. There was another sound behind him. He turned so fast Clara didn't know what was happening. A second wolf lunged out. Jonah threw his arm out, sending it rolling down the slope. The wolf growled and lunged again. Clara jumped to her feet. Jonah. He did not look at her. He quickly grabbed another branch of fire. As the wolf lunged closer, he swept it away. The flames grazed its fur. It howled in pain and ran away. A third howl sounded in the distance. The leader's howl calling the pack back. Only then was Clara able to breathe again. Jonah dropped the branch and knelt down a little exhausted. Clara ran over. "Are you okay? Were you bitten? Are you—" She reached out and touched Jonah's arm. Her fingers trembled slightly. Jonah looked down at where Clara touched him. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. He just looked and let it be. Clara touched him again, more firmly. "Are you okay?" Jonah shook his head, signaling he was unhurt. Clara gasped, her eyes stinging. "You scared me to death." Jonah looked at her. A long, deep look. So deep that Clara felt like he was trying to say something. But his throat wouldn't let him. Then he bowed his head slightly. An apology. Not in words, but in the eyes of someone who was used to keeping everything in silence. Clara gently placed her hand on her chest where her heart was pounding. Jonah Hale. No newlywed wants to lose her husband on the first night. Jonah was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled. A small smile. But enough to warm the fire in Clara's heart. Mornings are slow in the West, especially in early winter. The sun takes its time, as if it needs time to decide whether to rise over the mountains or leave humanity in darkness for another day. Clara woke to a still gray sky. The fire had died down, only a few red embers glowing beneath the ashes. She shivered, pulled back her cloak, and looked around. Jonah sat a few feet away, leaning against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. He wasn't sleeping. All night she realized he hadn't really slept. He just sat there listening, watching, straining at every little sound like a wild animal conditioned to live in fear and alertness. Clara sat up, gently adjusting the ashes, trying to build some warmth into the fire. "Have you been up all night, Jonah?" Jonah looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Not to boast. Just the truth." Clara smiled slightly. "Thank you for watching while I sleep. But tonight, we'll find somewhere safer." Jonah said nothing, but his eyes seemed to agree. The sky was lightening. The gray of night slowly faded into the soft orange of morning. The road ahead was still long, but at least they had survived the night of the wolves. Clara stood up, packed her things, and prepared to continue her journey to the land where she had been promised before the man who had sent her the letter had died. By noon they had reached the golden pine forest. The road leading into the valley was narrow but beautiful, lined on both sides with tall pine trees, trunks thicker than a man's arm, the smell of pine resin in the air creating a strange sense of peace. She remembered the man at the horse station saying, "It's the most beautiful land around, but also the most desolate." Clara slowed down when she saw the shape of a small cabin appear between the trees. It does exist, but as the warning says, it's mostly just the skeleton of a house that was never finished. The wooden walls were half-built, some of the planks blown off by the wind. The roof was slanted and the window frames were reduced to a few rotten slats. Weeds had grown over half the yard. The only thing still standing was the front porch post, where someone had tried to draw a few small symbols in charcoal, perhaps to mark the direction of the wind. Clara sighed. "This is my home." Her voice was small, not sad, but tinged with regret. Jonah stepped forward and walked around the cabin without saying anything. He pressed his hand lightly against a wooden beam and heard it creak. Then he looked at the roof, at the frame, and frowned. Do you think it can be saved?" Clara asked. Jonah didn't answer right away. He bent down and picked up a splintered piece of wood, running his thumb through the grain, testing the decay. After a few seconds, he turned back and nodded. But Clara felt more reassured than any promise. That afternoon they set to work cleaning up. Clara gathered wood, pulled weeds, and cleared the ground. Jonah used a dry log as a lever to rebuild the frame of the cabin. In a few hours he was sweating so much that his shirt was turning black down the back, but he did not complain, did not rest, and went about each task with a steady, composed hand. Clara put a pot of water on the camp stove. When she saw Jonah using his bare hands to pull down the heavy plank, she hurried over. "Wait, let me help." Jonah shook his head, but Clara kept one end of the board. "I'm not that weak." She gave a small smile. Jonah looked at her, and for the first time that day, his eyes were no longer guarded. As the sun set, they lit a small fire on the porch of the cabin. Clara washed her face with some cold spring water and wiped her muddy hands. Jonah sat sharpening a stick of wood with an old dagger Clara had never seen him use. They sat side by side a few feet apart, watching the sunset spread over the distant mountains. The world was bathed in a warm orange-yellow, and Clara felt warm inside. "Jonah," Clara called softly, "where did you live?" "Before you were taken," Jonah paused. Clara was a little worried that she had asked too soon. But then Jonah looked out at the distant mountains. Just from that look, Clara knew the answer. He had lived here, in these woods, amid the loneliness the West had carved into him for years. "You don't have to say it," Clara said softly. "I just want you to know. I'm not afraid of you." Jonah narrowed his eyes, looking disbelieving. Clara nodded slightly. "Really, if I were scared, I wouldn't have stood in front of that cage." A faint smile crossed Jonah's lips. Not clear, not full, but beautiful, in a very real way. When night fell, Clara opened her suitcase and took out an old woolen blanket. "I only have one. Use it." Jonah looked at the blanket, then at Clara. He shook his head, pushing her gently toward him. "Jonah, you fought a wolf last night. You can't sleep like this." Clara tried to give it back, but Jonah shook his head, more determined. Then he got up, went into the cabin, and took some dry pine needles to make a bed for himself. Clara watched him go, her heart sinking. "You've been alone for so long," she thought. "You've stopped accepting anything good for yourself." She sat close to the fire, pulling the blanket closer. The wind blew harder. The branches rubbed together with a dry sound, but in the midst of all this desolation, Clara felt less lonely than usual, because in Jonah's silence there was something that made her believe he was trying to protect her in his own way. A few hours later, as Clara was about to fall asleep, she heard light footsteps. Jonah returned from the cabin, a small bundle of firewood slung around his arm. Clara opened her eyes. "You're not asleep yet," Jonah didn't answer. He bent down and added more wood to the fire. The flames flared, the light illuminating his face, revealing a tired yet determined look. "Looking at him like that," Clara called softly. "Jonah." Jonah looked up. "You don't have to watch over me all night," Clara said slowly, her words weaving together. "I've lived long enough to know how to protect myself." Jonah bowed slightly, as if acknowledging she was right, but sat down, leaning against the log near the fire. He wasn't going anywhere. Clara sighed, but a small smile appeared on her face. "You're just quiet. But sometimes silence is also a way of saying you care." Jonah turned away slightly, but Clara saw the slight twitch of his lips, a small yet genuine expression that softened her heart. Under the golden pine night, amid the whistling of the forest wind and the smell of burning pine, Clara understood one thing. Even though they had only just begun their journey together, there was something between them. Small, thin, but enough to keep them from sliding into the abyss of two lives that were already too lonely. A small ray of light. An unspoken promise. A beginning. Mornings in Golden Pine began with the sound of wind blowing through the pine trees. The wind made a sound like the endless sigh of the forest, mixed with the soft and melancholy sound of branches and leaves gently rubbing against each other. Clara woke up slowly, as if her mind did not want to leave the fragile peace left by the night before. The first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks in the cabin roof, scattering them in gossamer streaks. Clara rubbed her eyes and looked around. Jonah was no longer in the cabin. She heard the soft tapping of a hammer outside. Steady, steady, unhurried. Like him. Clara stood up, brushed the dust off her skirt, and walked out onto the porch. Jonah was busy repairing the doorframe. The shirt he'd worn last night had been removed and hung over a nearby tree, leaving him in only an old, rough-spun undershirt. Part of his body was exposed in the dim light, the hard-defined muscles of someone used to hard labor and survival in the wild. But what made Clara stop and hold her breath were the wounds. Jonah had an old bullet wound on his right shoulder, a long, silvery-gray depression. On his left side was a long, jagged scar like a lightning bolt. On his back were healed cuts each several inches long, and especially around his neck was a faintly dark mark like the marks of a rope once tied tightly around someone's neck. Clara didn't know how long she stood there. Probably longer than she thought. Jonah noticed her gaze. He paused, his shoulders stiffening. It was a brief moment, but Clara sensed his alarm, as if he had been caught in a secret he didn't want anyone to see. Clara stepped closer, her voice softening. "Jonah, these wounds." Jonah turned away, not letting her look any longer. He quickly reached for his shirt and pulled it on. The movement wasn't rude but urgent, as if he needed a layer to cover not just his skin but something deeper, memories he didn't want anyone to touch. Clara was afraid she had said something that would upset him. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." She spoke softly, as if afraid the wind would hear. Jonah shook his head. He didn't look at her, but the hand clutching the edge of his shirt trembled slightly. Not much, just enough for the observant to see that this was not the reaction of a man without emotion, but the reaction of someone who had lived so long with old horrors that even a look could bring back painful memories. Clara sat down on the steps. "You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to. I know. There are pains that don't need to be spoken, they still exist. Like the way the wind blows through the woods, everyone hears but no one sees." Jonah paused for a beat. In his broad chest, the breathing stopped and started again. Clara looked out into the deep woods, where the light filtering through the trees created streaks of light and shadow. "I lost someone very important to me, and after that, I couldn't talk about it for years. People thought I was strong, but they didn't know. I just hid." Jonah turned his head slightly, just a little, but enough to let Clara know he was listening. "Wounds sometimes aren't just skin deep," she continued. "They're in places no one can see, and you're not the only one with them." A light breeze blew, lifting a stray strand of hair from Jonah's forehead. He stood still for so long that Clara thought he would disappear into the woods as he had the night before. But suddenly, he sat down less than 3 feet from her. It was the first time Jonah had taken the initiative to approach her like that. Clara remained silent, respecting the fragile space that had just formed between them. A wordless space, but filled with more than 100 conversations. Jonah reached for the long piece of wood and set it before him. He used the tip of his knife to carve lightly into the surface of the wood. Each delicate line carved his life into it, not in words but in drawings. First he drew a small wooden house with a low roof and square windows. Next to it he drew 2 small figures, an adult and a child. The child stood close to the adult, holding onto his shirt, as if that were the safest place in the world. Clara put her hand to her chest, feeling her heart sink. "It's..." Jonah didn't look at her. He just continued writing. The next image was of silhouettes with guns, then flames, then a burning house, smoke, and a thinly carved hanging loop, as if he was afraid to touch his own past. Clara held her breath. "Jonah," her voice caught. He stuck the knife into the ground, set the log aside, then stood up and took a few steps his back to Clara, as if the revelation had left him too naked. Clara stood up and followed, keeping a comfortable distance. She didn't touch him. She didn't force him to turn around. She just spoke in the warmest voice she could muster. "You lost everything, right?" Jonah stood still. His hands were clenched at his sides. His shoulders shook just a little, but Clara saw it. The West had taken his family, and they had hanged him again with prejudice. Clara took a deep breath. "Jonah, from the moment I looked into your eyes in that cage, I knew you weren't a cruel man. Cruel men don't look like you. They don't have the eyes of those who suffer." Jonah turned back, slowly, very slowly. The moment their eyes met, Clara saw something break inside him, not in words but in a look of someone who had forgotten how to trust but was trying again, if only with his eyes. Clara took a step further. I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I'm not forcing you to tell me, but I want you to understand. From now on, you don't have to carry this pain alone." Jonah closed his eyes for a brief moment. It was a small act, but for someone like him, it was a surrender to the trust Clara had just given him. A jay flew by, the flapping of its wings echoing in the still air as confirmation that this moment was really happening. Clara looked at the unfinished wood carving on the ground. Those simple drawings held more than a story. They held memories. They held the loved ones he had lost. They held the helplessness of a man who had tried to protect what he loved and then had it all taken away. And Clara understood. She had just seen the deepest part of Jonah Hale, the part no one in Red Horizon had ever seen. Not a monster, not a hunter, but a man pushed into the darkness by life, still surviving, still silent, still walking when there was nothing left to hold him up. Clara picked up the piece of wood, cradling it in her arms as if it were the most precious thing Jonah had ever shown her. She spoke softly, like a promise. "I will help you. Mend everything." Jonah opened his eyes. They were slightly red, not from crying, but from holding back too much. But for the first time, he didn't turn away. As the sun dipped west, light spread over the unfinished cabin. The wind carried the faint scent of pine. The valley was bathed in the pale yellow light of the dying day. Clara placed the log on the porch as a reminder that the two shared something irrevocable. Jonah walked over and stood beside her. He didn't speak, but he moved a tiny bit closer. Just a tiny bit. Enough for Clara to feel that he had allowed her presence into his life. Just one step, but a big one. Out of the darkness of the past, into the light of the fragile trust that had just begun to form between them. That afternoon the sunlight dyed the golden pine valley a golden yellow. The tall pine trees cast long shadows on the ground, creating black streaks that overlapped each other like long fingers of the forest reaching out to grasp the evening curtain. The wind blew gently, not as cold as the previous days, carrying the scent of pine resin mixed with the scent of damp earth after the night wind. Clara built a small fire on the porch of the cabin. She found the last of her cornmeal in her bag and some dried beans and made a simple soup. She knew it wouldn't be a full dinner, but it would warm her stomach after a long day. Jonah sat nearby, not too far away, using an old dagger to carefully sharpen a new piece of wood. The sunlight shone on his hands, firm fingers scarred but still deft. Just watching him work, Clara sensed the calm in his movements. "Do you want anything to eat before it gets dark?" Clara asked, her voice soft as if afraid to break the peaceful atmosphere. Jonah paused for a beat. He looked up at her, then nodded. No words, but enough. Clara placed the small iron bowl in his hands. Jonah took it carefully, as if afraid to lose the rare warmth. When he brought the bowl to his mouth, Clara could see that his hand was shaking slightly. Not because of the cold, but because the feeling of someone cooking for him was so unfamiliar to him. She turned away, not wanting him to see her attention, but her heart warmed naturally. After a simple meal, the afternoon light fell a pale blue. Clara sat near a pine bush and folded the few things she had brought from Missouri. As she pulled out an embroidered handkerchief, a gust of wind blew it from her hands. The scarf floated in the wind and fell to the ground in front of Jonah. He bent down to pick it up. When his eyes fell on the handkerchief with its blue-threaded floral motif, his expression changed. It was unclear whether it was slight confusion or gentle surprise. Clara stepped forward. "It's a handkerchief I embroidered myself. I brought it to remind me of home." Jonah looked at the handkerchief for a second before handing it back. As Clara's hand touched the edge, her fingertips brushed his. The two of them paused. A small moment, but enough to ignite a strange feeling in Clara. As for Jonah, she saw him pause slightly, as if he had just touched something that had once been an important part of his life. After returning the handkerchief, Jonah stood up and walked to the open space in front of the cabin. He knelt down and used the tip of his knife to draw a few lines on the damp ground. Clara followed curiously. "You want to draw something again?" Jonah did not answer, but he continued drawing. First he drew a large circle, a little distorted but enough to be recognizable as a sun. Beneath it was a man standing in front of a cabin door, and next to it was a woman. Clara looked at him intently. "You're drawing us," Jonah hesitated for a moment, as if wondering whether to deny it or not. But he didn't erase it. He didn't hide it. He just kept drawing. This time he drew a thin arc above the two of them like the canopy of a cabin. Then he added a flower bed in front of the door. Clara sat down next to him. It looks nice. I used to see little houses like this in Missouri, with flowers on the porch and white curtains blowing in the wind. It was beautiful. Jonah paused. He looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then his gaze moved to Clara, deeper, more steady. A look that made it clear to Clara that something had changed in him. Not weakness, not helplessness, but desire. Very small, very faint, but more real than anything he had ever let slip before. Jonah bent down and continued drawing. This time his hand shook not from the cold but from the unfolding memory. He drew 3 figures standing next to each other times a man, asterisk, a woman, asterisk. A small child standing between the two held both of their hands. Clara held her breath. The image was clearer than any description. "Is that your family?" Clara asked softly. Jonah set the knife down. In the fading twilight, Clara saw his shoulders hunched slightly. Still no sound. But the pain was there like an old wound reopening. Clara gently reached a hand up to his shoulder. "Jonah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to remind you. If it hurts." Jonah looked up. His eyes were red but no tears fell. He didn't flinch from Clara's hand. He didn't back away. It was the first time he let someone else touch that pain. Clara put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You lost them." Not a question. A statement of fact, but with the gentlest expression a woman could give to a man who had lost his world. Jonah bowed his head. Then he reached up and touched his neck lightly, right where the rope had marked it. Just that one movement. But Clara understood everything. "You tried to save them," Clara whispered, "and they thought you were the culprit." The wind blew hard through the pines, making a sound like the long groan of the forest. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment as if to steady himself. Clara leaned closer. "Jonah, I don't know the whole story, but I see this evil men don't look like you. They don't paint their families with hands that shake like this." Jonah opened his eyes. The look was no longer wary. It was the weariness of someone who had carried pain for too long and, for the first time, someone didn't turn away from it. Clara continued, her voice a silent oath. "I don't know if I can help you heal, but if you want, I will go with you at least, so you don't have to carry this burden alone." Jonah looked at her for a long time. A very long time. His eyes seemed to say something he couldn't put into words. Then, gently brushing the dirt over the old drawing, Jonah drew a large circle around the 2 figures, a very distinct circle, as if he were protecting them from the rest of the world. Clara was silent, but her eyes stung. As it got dark, Clara prepared to go to sleep in the cabin, but Jonah remained sitting by the fire, looking at the drawings in the dirt as if conversing with his past. Clara stopped in front of the cabin door. "Jonah." He turned around. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," she said softly. "Not now. Not while I'm here." Jonah didn't answer, but Clara saw him place his palm on the drawing of 2 people in the dirt, touching it lightly, then touching the drawing of 2 people he had made that afternoon. Words were no longer necessary. He had chosen to let Clara enter that circle. That night the wind on the Golden Pine hillside not only carried the chill of late season but also a strange feeling as if the whole valley was waiting for something to happen. Clara lay on the thin mattress in the small cabin, listening to the wind blowing through the cracks in the door. The cabin was old, but thanks to Jonah's renovation, it had become much warmer. Across the room, Jonah lay on the rough wooden bed he'd set up in the farthest corner, keeping a respectful distance between them. But even though they were more than 10 feet apart, Clara could feel his calm presence like an old pine tree standing in winter, steady and silent. Clara tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Not because of the cold, but because of the drawing from this afternoon, and the look in Jonah's eyes when she put her hand on his shoulder. Something is changing. Quietly, without any hurry. Like the melting of snow in early spring, no one hears the melting, but by the time they notice, the whole forest has come back to life. Near midnight, Clara heard Jonah sitting up. Though his movements were slight, she felt them. Not wanting him to think she was watching, Clara lay still with her eyes closed. But the sound of the door opening slightly made her jump up and follow him, wrapping her scarf around her. Jonah went outside and stopped in a clearing where a few pine trees cast long shadows in the moonlight. The moon was not full that night, but it was bright enough to illuminate the thin flakes of snow that still lay on the ground. He knelt down in the same spot where he had drawn the drawing that afternoon. Then, like someone reciting an old prayer, he used his finger to gently brush away the dirt, revealing the faded circle pattern. Clara stood for a moment, then approached. "Jonah, it's cold. Can't you sleep?" He didn't look at her, but the movements of his hands slowed. Clara knelt beside him, not touching, just sitting with him. After a long moment, Jonah pulled something out of his pocket. A small silver bracelet, warped by age but still with delicate designs. He placed it on his palm and turned it gently in the moonlight. Clara asked very softly, "Belongs to your wife?" Jonah nodded. A small movement, but heavy as stone. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "You can tell me more, if you want." Jonah took a deep breath, as if drawing on the wind for courage. Then he spoke a short sentence, but the longest since Clara had met him. "They think I killed her." Clara was silent. Jonah looked down at the silver bracelet. "My wife, Marin. She was weak, had a difficult birth. But they didn't believe me. They said I was a source of bad luck, that men working with iron and fire were unlucky." Clara felt her hand unconsciously tighten around her shirt. "No. No one has the right to say that." Jonah pursed his lips, his voice hoarse. "They blamed me for not being able to save them. Then, when the 2 children were harmed by outsiders, they said it was a punishment from heaven. They said I was not worthy to be a husband and a father." Clara felt a dull pain, as if it was being transmitted from the man to her. Jonah continued in a voice so low the wind seemed to have to quiet down to hear. "They tied me to a post. They wanted to hang me. A few people tried to stop me, but hatred in small towns sometimes is stronger than the law." He gently touched the scar on his neck. The moonlight reflected off the white scar, making it stand out like undeniable evidence. "Jonah." Clara could only say his name. No words were enough to heal. But her presence, she hoped, would change something. For a long time the 2 of them sat in silence like that. There was only the sound of the wind blowing through the pine trees and Clara's heart beating faster by the minute. Suddenly the sound of horse hooves echoed from afar. Jonah immediately stood up, his eyes changing color, alert like a hunted wild animal. Clara heard it too. A horse. Not much, but heavy, hurried steps. Not riding around looking for someone. Worry struck. Those people from the new town. Are they coming here?" Jonah looked toward the trail leading into Golden Pine. A few seconds later, the silhouette of a man appeared in the silver moonlight. Clara tensed. Jonah stepped forward, putting himself between her and the oncoming man. The man stopped not far away. He was in his early 30s, dressed in a brown leather jacket with a neat mustache, and looked strong but not hostile. The horse exhaled smoke in the cold air. "Sorry I'm late," the stranger said, his voice tired but polite. "I'm looking for a lady named Clara Whitford." Clara took a step forward. "I'm Clara. What's the matter?" The man took off his hat. "My name is Eli Turner from Maple Ridge. I have a letter for you. From Missouri." Clara stood still. Missouri. The past she thought she had left behind. Eli Turner handed over the pale yellow envelope. "I was sent to deliver this. The sender said you must read it." Clara took the letter, her hands cold with excitement. Eli Turner looked at Jonah standing next to her and bowed slightly. "Sorry to bother you. I'll be right there." He immediately turned his horse and galloped off into the night. Clara stood still for a long time. The letter in her hand seemed 10 times heavier than usual. Jonah looked at her, his eyes full of silent questions. Clara took a deep breath and opened the letter in the moonlight. Each word was clear and sharp, cutting into her memory. "Clara, there is something about your husband's death. Something you need to know. We have found new evidence, and the person behind it is not who you think." She trembled. Her lips could not make a sound. Jonah stepped forward, standing closer as if ready to catch her if she fell. Clara continued reading. "And that person is related to someone living in the West. You need to be careful. And you need to leave that place before it's too late." The wind blew hard, making the torch on the cabin porch flicker. Clara fell to the ground. Jonah immediately supported her shoulders. Her eyes showed horror and confusion. "Jonah," her voice broke. The person involved was a man who lived in western Colorado several years ago." Jonah squeezed her shoulder. "Clara, what are you thinking?" Clara looked at him. Her eyes were conflicted, full of fear, but not of Jonah, but of the question that had just appeared in her mind. Could it be that her husband's past and Jonah's past intersect. A fear Clara didn't want to face but couldn't ignore. And the story suddenly takes a different turn, deeper, darker, and more dangerous. It's no longer about healing. It's about finding the truth, a truth that could save them, or destroy them all. In the small cabin in the middle of the Golden Pine Valley, the oil lamp flickered like a tired person's breath. Clara put the letter down on the table, her breath trembling as if blown by the mountain wind. Outside, the long black shadows of the pine trees slanted to the ground, and in the cabin the silence stretched so long that she could hear her own heart pounding heavily. Jonah stood across the table, his large hands clasped together. He didn't ask. He just looked at Clara, his gray eyes, always deep and dark, now filled with wariness and vague apprehension. He knew anything from Clara's past could shake the fragile foundation between them. Clara sat down in her chair, her hand on the letter. Jonah, she paused to catch her breath. The letter said that my husband's death was not what I thought, and that the person who did it had connections to this western region. Jonah stood motionless, only his jaw clenched slightly. Clara looked up, her voice like dry leaves rustling. Do you think it could have something to do with you? As soon as the question came out, Clara wanted to take it back. She saw Jonah flinch as if someone had placed a large stone on his chest. Jonah didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, old calluses from blacksmithing scars, from struggles for survival. Then he looked at Clara, his eyes straight, unflinching. He shook his head. Slowly, but firmly, Clara let out a soft breath, not because she truly doubted him, but because she was afraid that the question would hurt him. Sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have asked. It's just, I was scared. Everything happened so suddenly, and my past never really rested. Jonah reached out, and for the first time he took the initiative to touch Clara's hand, very lightly, very restrained. A wordless encouragement. Clara, he said softly, his voice hoarse from disuse, I know nothing about your husband, but if you want to find out the truth, he paused, searching for the right word, I'll come with you. A promise. Short, but strong as the mountain bedrock. Clara pursed her lips, trying to hold back tears. I thank you. More than you know. Morsas. Clara couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling of the cabin. The night wind whistled through the cracks in the door, carrying the smell of young pine and the cold against her skin. Her Missouri past flashed through her mind. The feud between her husband, Michael Whitford, and a group of townspeople. Malicious rumors. Faces that looked at her with pity and wariness. We have found new evidence. The words in the letter echoed like the sound of galloping horses around her head. New evidence means that what she believed all along may be wrong. Or worse, someone wanted her to believe it wrong. Someone wanted her to leave Missouri, so she wouldn't find out the truth. Clara raised her hand to her chest, where her heart felt heavy as stone. Suddenly she remembered Jonah's eyes that afternoon, the eyes of someone with old wounds but still gentle enough not to scare her. Part of her believed him, so much so that it surprised herself. Jonah, you may not be a part of this, but you may be the key to helping me face it. At dawn, while the sky was still dim, Clara sat up. The cabin was still silent except for the sound of the charcoal stove, which had almost gone out. Jonah slept on a wooden bed in the corner of the room, his long, messy hair lightly covering his forehead. His breathing even, but his face still had the tension of someone who had never slept deeply. Clara put on a thin sweater and went outside, standing on the porch. It was still early. The sky was fading from gray to pink, the wind carried a chill of thaw. Birds were beginning to call to each other from the distant pine trees. Clara closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She needed calm. She needed resolve. She needed a heart light enough to accept the truth whether it hurt or not. Footsteps behind her made her open her eyes. Jonah stepped out, his coat slung over his shoulders. He looked at her for a moment. Can't sleep, his voice was hoarse. Clara laughed tiredly. Impossible. Jonah nodded, understanding better than any explanation. He stood beside her, both of them, looking out at the eastern mountains where the sun was rising. After a moment, Clara said, Jonah, I want to find out who sent this letter, and I want to find out what they know. Jonah asked softly, Maple Ridge? Yes, Clara replied. I think we should go there. Jonah leaned against the railing, considering. It's a small town, but there are a lot of people traveling back and forth from Missouri. Maybe someone heard or knew. Clara turned to him. Do you mind? I know it's not the kind of place you want to be. Jonah looked away, his eyes darkening as he thought of the town, the law, and the judging eyes. But then he turned back. Clara, you stood by me when the whole town wanted me dead. I won't let you go alone. Clara smiled slightly, a smile that was a mixture of gratitude and emotion. So, we leave tomorrow morning, she said. Jonah nodded. That day both of them prepared for the trip times. Clara packed the necessary items. Asterisk, Jonah checked the saddles, fixed the halters, and gathered firewood so the cabin would be warm when they returned. Asterisk. They filled the canteen with water and prepared some cornflakes. No one said much. There was no need. A rhythm of coordination had formed between the two of them, natural and quiet, like water flowing over rocks. In the afternoon, as the sun slanted to amber, Clara stood in the patch of dirt where Jonah used to sharpen his wood at night. She looked at the lines he had left in the dirt, traces of the past, of pain, of what he had not dared to say out loud. Jonah stepped forward. Clara, I know the letter worried you, but maybe the truth isn't what you're afraid of. Clara turned to look at him. Jonah, I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm just afraid it will take me away from the only good thing I've found in years. Jonah frowned slightly. Good thing, Clara took a breath. Then she spoke honestly. Golden Pine. This cabin. The quiet life. And you. Jonah stood still. His eyes followed her as if Clara's every word was opening a door he had not dared to touch before. He said slowly, Clara, I'm not used to hearing such things. Then let me say enough for you, Clara continued softly. You didn't push me away, you didn't judge me, you didn't ask why I chose to help you. You just let me exist beside you. That was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. Jonah swallowed. His broad shoulders shook slightly as if he were bearing something too much for a heart that had been broken for so many years. Clara. He let out a long breath. The only good thing I have left is you. The words fell into the space between them, so light yet so strong that Clara felt her legs suddenly go weak. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with emotion. Tomorrow, we will find the truth. Together. Jonah nodded. A promise between two lonely people, but no longer lonely together. Night falls. A small fire burned in the cabin. The two sat facing each other, not speaking, only listening to the sound of firewood crackling. When Clara got up to go to bed, Jonah suddenly said, Clara. She turned back. Jonah looked at her for a long time before saying, Whatever the truth is, you will not lose me. Clara did not reply, but her look said it all. Tomorrow they will leave Golden Pine, heading toward Maple Ridge, and toward a part of the past that is waiting to be revealed. Tomorrow the truth will have its say. But tonight hope is still warm enough to warm both hearts. The morning they left Golden Pine, the sky was a soft, pale blue, cloudless. It was as if nature was sending a blessing, though Clara and Jonah both knew this would not be an easy journey. The early morning wind blew across the golden grass after the cold, making the grass shake like a pack of wolves hiding in the wind. Clara tied her pack to the back of her saddle, her hands shaking slightly but her eyes determined. She was always strong when she needed to be, and now was one of those times. Jonah stood nearby, checking the reins, tightening the water skin. He didn't say a word, but his every gesture showed he was prepared for any eventuality. Jonah, are you ready? Clara asked, her voice low but calm. Jonah looked up at the sky for a moment, then nodded. They mounted their horses and left the valley by a narrow dirt road that wound between the hillsides. Golden Pine faded into the distance, the small cabin, the old fire, the drawings in the dirt. All of it seemed to be carried by a gentle wind into the near but heavy past. The journey to Maple Ridge was more than 30 miles long. They traveled through wild lands, places of hunting, of settler quarrels, where it was believed the land held too many sad stories to rest in peace. The wind blew Clara's hair lightly behind her. Jonah rode to her right, his eyes scanning the road as if any danger might appear from behind a clump of trees. Clara broke the silence first. Jonah, have you ever been to Maple Ridge? Jonah nodded. Twice. And how did they treat you? A pause. Then Jonah replied, like everywhere else. Clara understood. The whispers, the wary eyes, the embellishments. She tightened her grip on the reins. So, You came back here today for me. Jonah looked at her, his eyes unwavering. For you. And for the truth. Clara smiled slightly, a smile that was a little painful but also warm. By noon, Maple Ridge came into view, smaller than Red Horizon but seemingly busier. Wooden houses lined the main street. Smoke rose from several houses, and the scent of cornbread and stew wafted in the air. Clara and Jonah stopped their horses in front of the only tavern in town, the Rusty Lantern. The sign swayed in the wind, the front windows covered in glass that was fogged with dust. As they entered, several eyes immediately turned to Jonah. Some stopped talking, some withdrew their glasses, some whispered to each other. Jonah walked without faltering, but Clara could feel the tension in his shoulders. Clara lightly touched his arm. Don't mind it. Jonah didn't speak, but his small nod made Clara feel he was trying. The two chose a secluded table in the corner. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with flowing silver hair, came over and placed 2 glasses of water. What do you need? She asked Clara, but glanced at Jonah warily. Clara smiled politely. I'm looking for information about a man named Eli Turner. He brings me mail from Missouri. Do you know where he hangs out in town? The woman crossed her arms. Eli. Nice guy. Come over for a drink this afternoon. But not now. If you wait, maybe he'll stop by. Clara nodded her thanks. The woman walked away, still glancing at Jonah once more. The man at the next table watched them too, trying to gauge the strange relationship between the gentle woman and the dangerous-looking man. Jonah sat up straight, but Clara sensed he was shrinking, not in appearance but in the silent look in his eyes that seemed to want to disappear from this room of prejudice. Clara leaned over. Are you okay, Jonah? Looked down at the table for a second, then nodded. Okay. Clara put her hands on the table, leaning slightly toward him, not much, but enough for anyone who looked at her to understand that she was not leaving this man's side. Almost an hour later, Eli Turner appeared. The door to the bar swung open, the wind whipping his leather jacket. He looked around the room, then saw Clara. His eyes lit up. Ah, Clara Whitford. He stepped back. I suppose you read the letter. Clara stood up. I need to know who sent the letter. And what evidence they're talking about. Eli nodded, taking his cap off the table. He looked at Jonah for a moment but didn't seem as apprehensive as the others. Okay, but what you're about to hear may shock you. He sat down. The sender doesn't want to be named, at least not yet, but they told me to pass on the word that your husband's death was linked to a gang of illegal liquor dealers. Clara frowned. Liquor dealer in Missouri, not just Missouri, Eli replied. They operate in Colorado, Wyoming, and some small towns out west. Remember that fight in your old town, when your husband got beaten up as a warning? Clara clenched her fists. Remember, that group is behind. Clara felt her throat dry. Eli continued. The letter sender said that her husband accidentally found out where they hid the goods, and they wanted to silence him. Clara took a slight step back as if the ground beneath her feet was weakening. Jonah looked at Eli with cold eyes, not out of anger at Clara, but out of bracing himself, feeling the thread connecting the truth to his past slowly tighten. Clara asked, So who was behind that group? Eli lowered his voice. The sender said that the leader of the liquor gang used to live in the Colorado area near where a big fire broke out a few years ago. Clara held her breath. The fire. Jonah's family. 2 stories seemingly far apart suddenly intersect like 2 mountain roads meeting at the top of a pass. Clara looked at Jonah. Jonah stood motionless, his eyes dark as a bottomless ravine. Eli looked at them both, then said, I don't know the whole story, but the letter's sender wants you to leave the West because that group has people still around. Clara asked quickly, What's his name? Do you know? Eli shook his head. All I was told was that he always used a nickname and had a special mark on his right hand. Clara asked again, her voice heavy as stone. What sign? Eli replied. A circular burn. From the forge. At that moment, Clara turned toward Jonah, an uncontrollable reflex. Jonah didn't look at her. He looked down at the table. Then he slowly opened his right hand, revealing not a burn, but a different scar, long old but not round at all. Clara breathed a sigh of relief. Jonah just said, Not me. Clara replied immediately, I know. Eli kept looking at them both as if trying to piece something together. But he used to live near the woods of eastern Colorado, where there was a big fire that killed a family. The mailman told me to mention. That story is related. In that moment, Jonah was swept away by the wind. His eyes darkened, his breathing quickened. Clara touched his arm lightly. "Jonah, are you okay?" Jonah took a deep breath. The breath felt as heavy as a mountain pressing down on his chest. "That fire," he said, his voice low and tight. "It was my house." Clara stood there, stunned. Eli whispered, "So, it seems the letter sender wants you to know that your past and his past," he looked at Jonah, "are tied together by the same person." No one said anything more. The truth had just come out, darker, deeper, more dangerous. Not just Clara's husband. Not just Jonah's family. The same hand is behind both tragedies. Clara and Jonah looked at each other. Fear, anger, and determination flared up in a single moment. They understood. The journey from now on was not just about finding the truth. It was about facing the man who had ruined both their lives. And their story, a widow and a man locked in a cage, has officially entered the most dangerous zone. The air in the rusty lantern thickened at Eli Turner's words. The laughter and chatter from earlier vanished, as if blown away by the wind. A few people at nearby tables still glanced their way, not out of curiosity, but because of the unease that had spread, as if something in the air had changed and everyone could feel it. Clara put her hands on the table, trying to steady her breathing. The letter, the fire, the bootleggers, her husband's death, and the man with the circular burn marks, all of them seemed to fit together in that moment. Jonah remained still as a statue, but Clara saw his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened under his tanned skin. Eli took a sip of water and leaned towards them, his voice low. "The sender told me that the man is currently hiding around Maple Ridge. He changes his name constantly, but the burn on his right hand cannot be hidden." Clara swallowed. "Do you know what he looks like?" Eli shook his head. "No face. Only that he worked in a large blacksmith shop in northern Colorado. He had an accident forging an iron ring and burned himself. He used the alias Cinder Hand, Ashes Hand. That name sounds as cold as the wind blowing through a cemetery in winter." Clara looked at Jonah. He was clearly trying to stay calm, but underneath the silence was a storm. "Clara," whispered Jonah, "the fire that burned down your house. People say it was an accident. But maybe it wasn't an accident." Jonah slowly raised his head, his eyes hardened like a flame that had been suppressed for too long, about to burst out. He spoke slowly, each word heavy as stone. "I've known for a long time." Clara was startled. "You..." "No," Jonah turned away, looking out the window where the sunlight was filtering in. "I don't have proof, but I always felt like there was someone there that night. The smell of alcohol in the fire, the sound of running footsteps. But when I tried to tell the town police, they said I was crazy from the pain." Clara closed her eyes. Another dark side of Western society, those outside the circle of trust, whose words are like flying sand. Eli clasped his hands. "The sender wants you two to leave the West because he is hunting people who know too much. He has killed several people who have touched his secrets." Clara asked quickly, "You mean he can also come to us?" Eli didn't reply, but his expression spoke louder than any words. The atmosphere in the tavern became stifling. Clara stood up. "We need to find the sender." Eli nodded. "There is one person who might know, but you have to be prepared. He is not easy to talk to and doesn't like people asking too many questions." Jonah stood up, his voice low but calm. "Lead the way." Eli looked into Jonah's cold, steely eyes for a long moment, then understood that there was no way to refuse. "I'll take you there, but now before the town starts making noise." They left the tavern and headed down Maple Ridge's main street. The midday sun whipped up a fine mist of dust. Their horses were tied in front of the tavern, but Eli signaled them to walk. "The owner of that place doesn't want to be seen receiving guests," he explained. They turned into a narrow alley that led toward the back of town, where shacks, warehouses, and old lumber yards lay side by side. The air here smelled of pine tar and hot metal, of both labor and untold stories. At the end of the alley was a low wooden house, its roof bent from the previous winter. Eli paused. "He's in there. His name is Harlan Pierce." Clara swallowed. Jonah surveyed his surroundings like a wild leopard before entering an enemy's den. Eli knocked on the door. The door swung open loudly, as if the person inside had been waiting for them. An older man stood in the doorway, gray-bearded, deep-set, slightly hunched. But what made Clara shudder was his expression, not quite angry, not quite wary, but too knowing. Harlan looked at Eli first, then at Clara, then stopped at Jonah. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse like gravel rubbing against each other. They entered a house much darker than the outside. Light filtered through a small window, illuminating wooden shelves filled with files, liquor bottles, and small boxes of indeterminate contents. Clara had a hunch that Harlan wasn't just some old loner, but the keeper of half the town's secrets. Harlan sat down in a chair and poured himself a glass of bourbon. "I know why you've come." Clara straightened. "You're the one who sent the letter." Harlan shook his head. "No, but I know the sender." He looked at Clara, his eyes dull but sharp as knives. "And I know why you were warned," Jonah said, his voice low but clear. "The man with the round burn mark, who is he?" Harlan propped his hands on his knees and sighed. "He has many names, but the one you need to know is Dawson Creed." No one said anything. Clara repeated Dawson. "Creed." Harlan nodded. "The leader of the liquor gang. He committed many murders that no one dared to investigate. And most of all," he paused, looking straight at Jonah, "he was the one who burned down your family's house." The air froze. Clara felt herself holding onto the chair to keep her balance. As for Jonah, he stood still, but his breathing was tight, his body as taut as a bowstring about to snap. Harlan continued, his voice as heavy as a collapsing rock. "That day, Creed wanted to take your land to open a road to transport illegal alcohol. Your father refused. He burned down the house as a warning. Unexpectedly, things got out of control." Clara saw Jonah's hand tremble slightly. Very slightly, but she had never seen him tremble around a man. Harlan looked at Clara. "And your husband, Michael Whitford, was the last person to see Creed in Missouri right before," he lowered his voice, "before he was killed." Clara raised her hand to her mouth. "So, Creed is behind." "Both of them," Harlan nodded. "Creed wanted to wipe out everyone who knew his secret liquor trade. Your husband, too. And Jonah's family." He looked at Jonah again. "You almost died because of him. That scar on your neck. It wasn't an accident." Jonah didn't move, didn't say anything. But Clara felt as if the memories were collapsing inside him. Harlan finished the rest as if sealing their fate. "Dawson Creed is currently hiding in the woods west of Maple Ridge, waiting for a new shipment to be delivered. If you want the truth, if you want justice," he looked at them both, "he's the one to face." Clara turned to Jonah, her eyes glistening with both fear and determination. "Jonah," she whispered, "let's go find him." Jonah looked up. In that moment, Clara saw clearly the old pain, the buried anger, and the determination that nothing could extinguish. He just replied one sentence, "Go," and that was the sign of a journey more dangerous than anything they had ever experienced. The air in Harlan Pierce's little house was still as heavy as ashes when Clara and Jonah stepped outside. The afternoon light had faded the western sky, turning a dull orange tint with a hint of purple. A fragile western beauty, but today tinged with sadness and foreboding. Clara stood on the porch, her handkerchief clenched in her hand as if seeking support from the overwhelming events. Jonah stood beside her, his broad shoulders like pillars against the wind, but Clara knew he was in turmoil inside. She looked at him. "Jonah, are you sure you want to face him now?" Jonah looked out into the woods where the trail led away from Maple Ridge. His eyes were those of someone who had seen the darkness too long and knew that only deeper into it would lead to escape. "Clara." His voice was low but not trembling. "He took everything from me. From you. I can't turn my back again." Clara thought for a moment. She was brave but not reckless. "We will find him." She nodded. "But we will not go as people who wish to die." Jonah glanced at her, his eyes lit with a new fire. Clara continued, "We will prepare, think, and act in a way that will keep him from hurting anyone else." A softness passed through Jonah's eyes. All his life of being hunted, beaten, accused, branded a monster. He had never had anyone stand by him to say that. Clara was the first. Returning to the rusty lantern to retrieve their horses, they found Eli standing at the door. He looked at them with a look that was half worried, half determined. "I know what you two are up to," Eli said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "If you two go alone, it won't work." Clara tilted her head. "Do you want to come along?" Eli chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "I'm no hero, but Creed caused trouble in Maple Ridge. Some of my friends disappeared because of his bootlegging. I want to put an end to that." Jonah looked at Eli, his eyes searching but not hostile. Eli understood what the look meant. He slowly raised his hand so Jonah could see it clearly. It was a hand without the circular burn. "I'm not him," Eli said curtly. Jonah nodded, and that was the first sign he accepted another person on this journey. They left town together as the sun was setting. The road into the woods west of Maple Ridge was a thin knife edge cutting through the darkness. The dark trees stood in rows like silent witnesses to the crimes hidden in the shadows. About an hour later, when the three stopped near the stream, Clara felt her legs go weak from the thoughts that piled up. She sat down on a large rock by the water. The stream flowed softly and clearly, as if trying to wash away the dust and fear of people. Jonah saddled his horse, his eyes always on the forest ahead. Eli sat down next to Clara. Creed is not an easy man to deal with. He is cunning and has a few loyal followers. But, he glanced at Jonah, he is not invincible. Clara looked at Jonah. He stood a little apart from the two of them, but not out of aloofness, but because he was always the one keeping watch. In the dim light, his shadow stretched across the ground. A long, lonely shadow, but also the shadow of a survivor. Clara spoke up, "Jonah." He turned back. "Are you afraid?" Clara asked, not to test him, but because she needed to know the truth in him. Jonah looked her straight in the eyes, deep and calm as a night lake. "Not afraid." He shook his head. "But I'm tired. Tired of running. Tired of losing. Tired of not being able to tell anyone I'm innocent." Clara felt her heart clench. That sentence, simple but containing the life of a man who had been beaten to the point of losing his voice. She stood up and stepped closer to him. "Jonah, I don't know if we'll find justice, but I know one thing for sure: you're not the man who deserves to be buried in vain." Jonah looked at her a long time. In his eyes, Clara saw a quiet storm rumbling but not breaking. Eli stood up, brushing the dust off his pants. "If we're going to find Creed, we need someone who knows the way." Clara asked. "Who?" Eli replied, his old guide. "A man named Mason Holt. He lives in a log cabin 7 miles from the edge of the woods. Mason was betrayed by Creed, and I think he's no longer loyal." Jonah asked briefly, "Is he trustworthy?" Eli shrugged. "Enough to not shoot us on sight." A true Western answer. They continued their journey as night fell over the forest. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting silvery streaks on the ground. Every branch and every rock seemed to hide a secret. After walking a distance, Clara spoke up, "Jonah, I want to ask you something, but if you don't want to say it, I won't force you." Jonah glanced at her and nodded slightly. Clara took a deep breath. "Did you ever think that you would find justice?" Jonah bowed his head as if listening to the echoes of the past. "I used to, when I first lost them." His voice was soft like wind through cracks in the stone. "But when I went to town asking for help, they called me a wild animal. When I left that place, I thought justice was reserved for those who had a voice." Clara touched his hand gently. "You have a voice now. Not in town yet, but with me." In that moment, Jonah stood still, as if a part of him had just been returned after years of loss. Eli ran forward, pointing. "There it is. The lights. Mason's cabin." They stopped their horses in front of a small hut, a flickering light coming through the crack in the door. People were wandering around the forest. The chirping of insects seemed to blend with the breath of the mountains. Eli knocked on the door. "Mason, come out, we need to talk." From inside came the sound of a chair being pulled out. A hoarse male voice replied. "Who is it?" Eli said quickly. "Eli Turner. I brought 2 people who need to see you." The door opened, revealing a man with a disheveled beard and red eyes from alcohol, but sharp as a machete. Mason looked at the 3 of them, lingering longest on Jonah. The tall man with the scar on his neck. Mason sighed. "I heard your story." Jonah didn't move. Mason crossed his arms. "You came looking for Creed, right?" Jonah nodded. Mason glanced at Clara, then Eli. "I can show you where he's hiding. But," Mason lowered his voice, "you have to know one thing first." Clara stepped forward. What Mason looked straight at Jonah. Creed didn't act alone. He had someone in town with him, someone powerful enough to protect him for years. No one said anything, but the 3 of them understood. The truth was more terrifying than they imagined. The enemy was not only hidden in the forest. He is in the middle of town. Inside the old wooden hut, the flickering oil lamp seemed to tremble with the breathing of the people standing there. A long silence fell over the room after Mason Holt's words. Creed's helper is in town. Someone with power. The words fell like a hammer. Clara felt a chill run down her spine, and Jonah, he stood straight motionless, but Clara could feel the undercurrent of pain rising in him like deep water under the surface of a lake. Eli broke the silence first. "Who, Mason? Who is it?" Mason lifted the decanter but did not drink. He looked as if he were weighing the matter of keeping his head or revealing a secret he had kept for so long. A man who has helped Creed escape the clutches of the law many times. He knows the terrain, knows the people, and has the ability to make those who dare to cross him disappear. Clara asked softly, "Are you talking about the Maple Ridge police chief?" Mason took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes, Sheriff Dalton Briggs." No one could say a word. That name, Briggs, was a man respected by the people of the area. The man who showed up when a drunken troublemaker was in town. The man who rode his black horse around town at dusk. The man who smiled at the children and drank black coffee every morning at the bakery. Clara had seen him when they first arrived in Maple Ridge. He seemed calm, serious, cold, and fair. But now, his name is associated with the bloody hands and the tragedies that Clara and Jonah are carrying on their bodies. Clara shuddered. Briggs. He knew Creed. Mason laughed coldly, the bitter laugh of someone who had lost faith. He wasn't just an acquaintance. He's been protecting Creed for years. In return, Creed gave him money and goods. Eli slammed his hand on the table. "Damn it," Clara whispered. "But why would Briggs target my husband? Michael has never met him." Mason looked at Clara for a long time, as if weighing whether she could bear the rest of the story. Finally he said, "Michael, your husband, used to keep a ledger of smuggling from Missouri to Colorado. He accidentally ran into the Creeds, and Briggs knew it." Clara's hand dropped to her side at those words. The notebook, Michael had kept it carefully, like he would never let anyone see it. At the time, Clara had thought her husband was just collecting business information. She never imagined it could be the reason he was murdered. Clara put her hand to her chest, stopping the cold feeling that ran down her stomach. "Michael was killed to silence him." Mason nodded. "Yes." Jonah, who had been silent until now, suddenly said, "What about my family? Is Briggs involved?" Mason's eyes changed. "Creed started that fire. But Briggs was the one who helped him escape, the one who helped him disappear into the night." Jonah closed his eyes. His face was expressionless, but Clara could see his whole world shaking. After a long moment he opened his eyes again, eyes like the ground after an earthquake. "I'll find Briggs." Mason held up a hand. "You can't go straight there. Briggs isn't stupid. He has guards, and he knows how to turn his enemies into ash before they can open their mouths." Eli frowned. "So what are we supposed to do? Sit back and watch him continue killing?" Mason lowered his voice. "No. You need proof. And you need somewhere he can't run." Clara asked, "Do you know that place?" Mason looked out the window where the moonlight fell on the ground. "In the woods west of Maple Ridge, near where the creek splits, there's a small canyon Creed used as a hiding place. Only he and Briggs know where it is." He looked back at Jonah. "If you go there, you'll find traces. Maybe old cargo. Maybe shipping logs. Maybe fingerprints, something Briggs can't deny." Clara bit her lip. "We don't have much time. Briggs might know someone digging up old stories." Mason nodded vigorously. "He's definitely on the lookout. Creed is too. If he knows you, Jonah, are alive and coming, they'll clean everything up." Jonah said slowly, "They will know." Then he looked at Clara for a long moment. "But we don't." As they left the hut, the night wind whipped against their faces as if testing their resolve. Clara pulled her coat tight, feeling fear creep under her skin, a fear that was both past and future. But then she looked at Jonah. He stood in the darkness like a large stone pillar, solid and unmovable. Jonah turned to her. "Clara, do you still want to continue?" She didn't think long. "I do. Michael deserves to know the truth. And you." She looked into his eyes, eyes that had endured so much pain. "You deserve your life back." Jonah didn't speak, but Clara saw his eyes soften like a night lake rippled for the first time in years. Eli stepped forward. "If we go now, we'll reach the edge of the forest before dawn. It's easier to be seen in the dark." "One now." Clara looked out at the black forest beyond, dark as a door opening underground. But she did not step back. Instead, she moved forward. The road leading to the canyon west of Maple Ridge was a treacherous one few dared to venture at night. Black branches brushed past them like the arms of the past trying to stop their steps. Horses panted each step cautious on the rotting leaves. Clara whispered, "Eli, is Mason sure about this way?" Eli replied, "Mason knows Creed like he knows his face in a mirror. If he says this way, it must be right." Jonah rode ahead, his eyes always fixed on where the darkness was thickest. Clara had the feeling he heard more and saw more than either of them. As they walked deeper into the woods, Clara sensed something. Her fear was no longer as sharp as when she had read the letter. It had turned into something else, a sad but strong determination, a feeling that only those who have lost everything can understand. Near midnight, they stopped at an old pine tree. Eli pointed. "The canyon is half a mile away. We have to walk from here to avoid making any noise." Clara dismounted. Jonah moved closer, offering his hand to help her down. His fingers brushed her wrist just a touch, but it warmed Clara's heart. They walked in the dark. The wind whistled through the rocks. Moonlight glinted off the rugged cliffs. When they got there, Eli signaled them to stop. "Here," he whispered. Ahead of them, a narrow canyon opened up like a large crack in the ground. From it wafted the scent of strong liquor mixed with the dry, rocky soil. A perfect place to hide contraband. Jonah was the first to enter. The pale moonlight illuminated the dirt floor where very old footprints were still faintly imprinted. Clara followed, her heart beating slowly but strongly. When they saw the object lying on the stone floor, Clara froze. A broken wooden barrel, a charred piece of cloth, and a circular burn mark on a piece of iron, the mark of the forge where Creed had worked. Jonah knelt down. He touched the iron ring. His hand was shaking, but Clara knew it wasn't from fear. Eli said, "Here it is, something that can incriminate them." Clara noticed something else near the piece of iron was a piece of paper with torn edges. The writing faded but still legible. "DC, Mr. Briggs. Friday. Next delivery." Clara covered her mouth. "This is proof that Briggs and Creed were working together." Jonah stood up, not angry, not explosive, but calm as a mountain recovering from a cut after many years. "We bring this into the light," he said in the deepest, surest voice Clara had ever heard. Before he could say more, the sound of a branch breaking came from behind. Eli turned around. "Wait! Someone! A small explosion!" Rocks and dirt flew up. Clara screamed. Jonah pulled Clara and Eli behind a large rock. From above the cliff came a familiar hoarse laugh. A man's voice shouted in the darkness. "I knew it. You guys would come here." As predictable as a drawn map, the shadow of a man stood on the cliff, his right hand holding a pistol. The moonlight shone down, highlighting the round burn on her hand. Dawson Creed's laughter echoed off the cliff like metal falling into a cavern, cold, rusted, and eerily familiar. Clara pressed herself against the rock, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Jonah stood before her, and Eli, his body taut as a bowstring. The moonlight shone on his face, revealing the scar across his neck, Dawson's mark. Creed laughed again. "I heard on the wind that you two came looking for me." He held up his right hand, the one with the circular burn, the rough skin glinting in the moonlight. "See, no need to look for me. I came." Eli gritted his teeth. "Creed bastard." Creed slowly rotated the gun as if savoring the moment. "Turner, I remember you. When you were rummaging through my cargo, I thought you were smart. Turns out, you were just curious." Mason Holt emerged from the shadows, breathing heavily as if he had arrived immediately after the explosion. "Creed, stop. This is enough." Creed laughed so hard he doubled over. Mason, I knew you were a traitor. You think I wasn't watching. Your cheap loyalty doesn't fool anyone." Clara grabbed Jonah's wrist. "Don't rush. We have to figure it out." Jonah looked at her for a second, just a second, but Clara sensed the fierce struggle inside him between the rage that wanted to burn everything and the silent promise that he wouldn't let her be in danger. From above, Creed changed his voice, low, sharp as a knife. "Clara Whitford, I must give you credit. Not many people dare come here to find out the truth about their husbands." Clara snapped. "You killed my husband, and he didn't deserve to die." Creed shrugged. "He knows too much, like Hale's family over there." Jonah took a step forward. Clara grabbed his arm. Creed pointed at Jonah. "Your house, too flammable. Dry wood, high winds, A spark, a moonless night. Who knows what happened, Jonah said in a low voice so deep that the ground seemed to shake. I know. Creed laughed. It doesn't matter. What matters is, no one believes you. You're something every town wants to get rid of. A stray dog. A light passed through Jonah's eyes. Not pain, but renewed faith. He said, I have people who believe in me. Jonah tilted his head, looking at Clara. Creed smacked his lips. Oh, that's touching. But it's been a long time since I've killed anyone under the moonlight. Tonight's appropriate. Clara pinned Jonah's arm. Jonah, stay behind me. Listen to me. We can't let him drag us into his position. Creed raised his gun, aiming directly at Clara, not Jonah. He knew the man before him's weakness. Jonah rushed out instinctively. Clara shouted, No, a gunshot. Rocks crashing to the canyon floor, dust flying. But no one fell. Creed's gun clicked, it jammed. Eli shouted, Now! Jonah grabbed tree roots along the cliff, climbing up like a panther. Creed turned to run, but Jonah was close. Mason threw a log to block his way. Creed swung his knife. Jonah dodged. They rolled down the cliff, dust and dirt flying in the moonlight like sparks. Clara ran to the edge of the cliff, her heart pounding in her chest. Jonah, Jonah. Below, two figures wrestled in the darkness. Creed snarled. Your house deserves to burn. Your wife cries like a cat. Your kid screams like Jonah shouted. Shut up, anger is no longer violence. It is pent-up pain unleashed like a broken dam. Creed kneed Jonah, trying to push him over the edge. Jonah slipped but caught a tree root. Clara screamed, Eli, come down and help him. Eli slid down the slope, though the rocks almost made him slip. Creed cursed, turning to draw the sidearm from his ankle. Clara saw the flash of metal and terror gripped her. She shouted, Jonah. To the left. Jonah spun just as Creed pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed his shoulder, blood spraying like red mist in the wind. Eli jumped in, attacking Creed from behind. The gun flew from his hand and rolled onto the rocks. Creed punched Eli hard in the face, knocking him down onto a large rock. Clara screamed. Eli Mason slid down another ramp, rushing toward Creed. But Creed was quicker. He grabbed Mason and held the knife to his throat. Clara stood frozen. Jonah stood, blood running down his arm, his eyes hard, wild, and pained. Creed shouted, Put him down, everyone back, I will kill him. Mason gasped. Jonah, don't. He'll kill everyone if you back off. Creed tightened his grip on the knife. I don't mind. Clara shouted. Creed, you're not getting away, the evidence we found. Creed laughed like a madman. Evidence? What you found is worthless if you don't get it out of here. He pulled Mason closer. I'll just kill the three of you and leave you in the canyon. Tomorrow morning, who will remember you came to Maple Ridge. A strong wind whipped through the sound, was like the roar of the earth. Jonah took a step forward. His whole body was shaking with blood, but his eyes were filled with a strange light, a light Clara had never seen before. He said softly enough for only Clara to hear, Don't be afraid. Clara looked at him, her eyes were wet. Jonah, please. Don't risk it. I don't want to lose you. Jonah turned to face her. A brief moment, but a lifetime. He whispered, Clara, I am alive again thanks to you. Then he turned back to face Creed. His voice rang out loud, firm and powerful. Creed, let go of Mason. You want me, don't you? It's me. Creed paused for a moment. The hatred in his eyes turned to an almost befuddled brutality. He pushed Mason aside and lunged at Jonah with his knife flashing. Jonah didn't back away. He caught the blow with his wounded arm, blood spraying into the air like red flowers. He spun, grabbed Creed's wrist, and pinned him to the stone floor. Creed shouted, You will die like them. Jonah put all his strength, all his pain, all his memories, all the love that had been taken away into one final push. Creed lost his balance, slipped, and fell off the cliff edge, slamming into the canyon floor below. The sound of the fall was heavy like breaking rocks. Silence. Long. The wind stopped. Clara held her breath, her hands shaking so much she had to kneel down. Eli gasped, looking down. He didn't get up again. Jonah stood there like a man who had weathered a storm. He looked down at Creed's still body, then up at Clara. Clara ran over. Jonah, your shoulder, Jonah, fell to his knees as the strength left his legs. Clara caught him, her hands clutching his shirt tightly, as if afraid he would disappear from her arms if she didn't hold on tight. Jonah said nothing. He just rested his head on her shoulder. Jonah, Clara choked. You're okay, you hear me, you're okay. After a long while, he whispered, "Clara, my family has been given justice." She hugged him. "And you have your life back." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the rock, they left the canyon, carrying the evidence, the iron ring, the wooden crate, the piece of paper with D.C. Briggs, and even the living witness, Mason Holt. Sheriff Dalton Briggs was arrested before he could cover his tracks. His stony face lost its composure as Eli and Mason gave their statements and Clara laid out the evidence on the table. Jonah stood back, saying nothing, but his eyes said it all. A few weeks later, Golden Pine returned to peace. Clara stepped down onto the porch of the newly rebuilt cabin, the roof straight and sturdy. The wind carried the scent of young pine trees as gentle as someone's caress. Jonah stood in the yard, his arm still bandaged but his body feeling better. He watched Clara walk down the steps, his eyes filled with a peace he never thought he would feel again. Clara stepped forward. "The sun is beautiful today." Jonah nodded. "Beautiful, like something is starting." Clara looked at him, soft but deep. "Do you have anything to say?" Jonah stepped closer, only a few inches between them. He took out from his pocket the small wooden object he had been carving over the past few days. A wooden bracelet, simple yet elegantly carved. He placed it in her hand. "Clara, I don't have much to say, but if you want, we can rebuild this life, little by little." Clara looked at the bracelet, then into his eyes. She smiled, a smile filled with tears, but tears of hope. "Jonah Hale, I started choosing that the first day I saw you. The wind blew through the trees. The birds flew up. Golden Pine glowed with a new peace, the peace of truth, of justice, of two hearts that had lived in darkness, finding their way back to the light. And their story from that moment on no longer began with loss, but with rebirth. The story of Clara and Jonah is not only about love, but also about broken hearts that are brave enough to open up again. At every age, people have their own scars, but the most beautiful thing is that even when a heart is torn, it can still beat again, slowly but stronger than before. We all carry pain that no one else sees. And sometimes just one person who believes in us, looks at us with eyes that don't judge, is enough to heal a broken life. Jonah found his voice again. Clara found peace again. And both found themselves again. Perhaps in life, you have also lost the most precious thing. But this story wants to remind you there is still hope, there are still beautiful beginnings even in the years that seem to be late. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of the story. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring stories that touch your heart.